Hi guys, welcome to another Play Basic blog. This one will talk mostly about this question that came in. Unfortunately, it's months ago now, I think, but we'll have a bit of a look at it. So the topic of the question is, what is the future of Play Basic? Now, I've been asked about this a lot, pretty much the whole way through PB's existence. I think we started out for the first builds of PB in about 2002, somewhere in there into 2003. So it's 2020 today. That's a long time. And back then we had a very distinctive roadmap, but things change over time. The roadmap was set up based on a certain level of interest in the product. Future versions were dependent upon if people liked the first version, then we'd build a second version, so on. If they didn't, there's no point building a second one. But let's get into this conversation quickly. First question is very open, very general. What is the future of Play Basic? Now, I did answer the question. When was this posted? Wow, July, 22nd of July. And it's September now. So here I'm quickly generalised. There are lots of things I like to do. We've talked about endless ideas in the past. And pretty much in every blog, live video I make, I'm filling out people to see if they're interested in ideas. If there's no response, those ideas get chucked. I'm not going to waste time implementing things for people who couldn't care less. Fact. Right. But the reality here for me has changed a lot. In the last 4 years, I've been a primary carer for someone with Alzheimer's. And that's a 24-hour day job. It's a 7-day-a-week job. It's not something you can just, go and have 8 hours a day to do what you want. You just don't get that time. That's a big culture shock. Now, this is not a new thing for me. This actually started to happen about 2000 and probably 11, probably 12. It was particularly bad. Into 13 was really bad. And ever since then, it's been progressively worse. These are my parents, by the way. So after my father passed away, the primary care of my mum turned to me. Now, I have siblings, but they're unable to do it because they understand what kind of a time trap it can be. Now, for things like programming, that's really why I haven't done any massive bits of programming really in that time. Most of the things I try and do, I try and slot in to a few months at the most, or maybe a few, maybe a 6-month period, because I know I'm not going to have long, all a 40-hour week to do them in. Because this is not a commercial, as in professional project. This is effectively a hobby project these days. It's probably been going back to when we started, it was certainly more of that. We needed to make a return to warrant the time that gets invested in these things. And if you're wondering how much time it takes to build anything of any size, even something that's, I guess most people would call Play Basic quaint, you'd be horrified. It takes a lot of time to get even the simplest thing done, because before they get to you, they've got to be, we've got to add a feature, make announcements to people, field questions that come back in. There's a lot of time that you end up, even when you have limited time, you end up fielding a lot of wasting a lot of time in that cycle has nothing to do with progressing the product. So yeah, for me, time is a big factor. So I've got to be very cautious about what I try and commit to. If I want to do something, it's really for my own entertainment. Next question. So, will there be a roadmap or wish list to Play Basic? Now, there's been a roadmap for PB from day one. To recap, for those people who weren't around back in 2004, I guess it was released, I think it was. We had a roadmap almost straight away that we wanted to have the base version, then what we were terming as an effects version, which is like pretty much a rewrite, but with extra functionality and probably more advanced than the base version, and then a 3D version extension for that second version, the PBFX version. So here I'm just sort of going, there are various internal roadmaps, which is very true. I'll dig up a roadmap in a minute, we'll go through it actually. And this is also true, the roadmaps aren't secrets, they've been discussed in public ad nauseum with people. And every time we try and nail down an idea with the public, it's virtually crickets. You never get a response. It's almost pointless. The reason for that is often that people think that, hey, you're working on something, hey, why don't you go and add this other 10 other things in the meantime? And it just doesn't work out like that. You just can't go and do 10 other jobs while you're trying to do this one thing that you're working on at the moment. And the original roadmaps were like a stepping stone from the base version of Play Basic. A lot of things that are in PB today were never meant to be in it. Things that you might be surprised at. They're meant to be in PBFX, but life moves on. There's a bunch of language features that have never been implemented into PB that were meant to be in PBFX, and some of the things were migrated between the two. The roadmaps were more of a stepping stones from where we started moving towards effects in 3D, okay? And most of that's irrelevant today, which is very true. Effects was going to be based on pretty much a DX7 version and then a DX9 version. Now that's old. That's old news completely. These days I wouldn't do anything other than just GL. I wouldn't even care about DirectX at all. Possibly. I mean, my arms could be twisted, but there would be a really good reason to build a version that only runs on one platform. And I can't think of one for a 2D language for beginners. I mean, that sounds crazy to me. And the second part of the question was about requests, and we have a request forum. We've had a request forum for, as long as I can remember. Different than other parts of the board, it's a moderated section. If you've ever been to a forum where people are asking about requests or feature ideas for adding to a product, you get these threads that have hundreds of posts, and people post 10, 15, 20 different ideas in one line increments, one line descriptions about what these things are, and that's not very useful. Then you have to go through that, wade through them, work out what things are actually important to people and what things are wish list typey stuff, So in the request forum, there's an FAQ about what kind of requests we want to see, pretty much. And that's to weed out repetition, there was an awful lot of that stuff initially, and to make sure that when you make a request, you're making a request based on an obvious need, and you outline its implementation. Because you might say, well, add a physics engine. Okay, which one? There's a bunch of them. And if I add a wrapper, if I write my own wrapper for something, and 6 months later you're going, oh no, it doesn't work the way I wanted it to. Well, what you should have done initially is lay out how you imagine this thing being implemented. And that's more useful. And then that starts a dialogue between the user base, us, can work out how they want to see these things implemented. Ideally, working out some sort of approach from whether it's a what the functions might do, how they might act, etc. So that's how we handle requests. To be honest, it's been pretty mishmashy. You often get those requests where it's a one-line response. Hey, add this with nothing else, or hey, add PlayStation 4 support or something. Okay, let's just rewrite the whole thing to suit a one-line request. Sounds really practical. So you've got to keep within a degree of what's practical and what's not. Jumping on platforms that require whole rewrites, that's not very practical. And if we did that, we certainly wouldn't be doing it for free. Or maybe if we went, dumped it out to some third party, it might be free. But anyway, next part of the request thing is, will PB rise from the ashes? I don't think it will. I think in general the market for beginner basics that handle 2D is flooded, and there are a lot of really good mature free options today that do the 2D basic thing. So it's hard to sort of go, well, there's demand there, but there really isn't demand there. I can't see it anyway. I think there's demand for products that do quick and easy sort of web deployment. That's certainly the case, and that's what I would like to get into. But again, time and desire from the community are actually a big issue with that. Anyway, how many members are still using PlayBasic? This is one of those questions like, how long is a piece of string? I have no idea. I can tell you how many people download it. You ask yourself the same question. When you download something, do you install it? I don't. Often I'll download something out of curiosity. I'll think, well, I'll download that for later. So I don't think download's a very good metric. So you can't really use sign-ups as a metric either. Orders are probably a poor metric as well, because it's very sporadic. For me, it really comes down to how many people are writing stuff with it, how many people are doing something with it, and there's not many people. Occasionally, people pop up and they're working on some sort of idea, concept, doing their thing. That's awesome. That's what PB was meant to be for. So you could sit down, knock out an idea in something familiar to classic programmers, which was BASIC. I think we've covered those, have we? What are we talking about here? All right, so the rest of this thread's got a bit of chit-chat here. I'll just go over it quickly, I guess. How many people use that? Okay, so yeah, well, so the response was, I think the user base of PlayBasic needs to be enlarged. Okay, well, how are we going to do that? Really need to look into how PlayBasic user base can become a larger user base. I want to see a big PlayBasic community. Well, I don't know, 10 years ago, people were hassling me like crazy to get on social media. Those same people that were hassling me about getting on social media never participated in the pages, never liked the pages, shared them, did any of those things. In case you don't realise that if you want to go and really put money into social media these days, it costs a fortune to promote your product all the time. Why would you go and advertise the old version? Makes no sense to me. As for user base, unfortunately it comes down to those people who are registered, those people who have accounts. They either use the demo version or they've got a retail version or whatever they have. I don't care. They have to sit down and make something. and post about it on the forum, and maybe tweet about it, maybe put it on, make some sort of video for YouTube or Facebook, whatever your social media platform is of choice. And those tend to work much better than me doing it. In fact, I can guarantee you they work better than me doing it, because people don't really listen to me. In general, and that's fine. I don't have a problem with that at all. There's no reason for people to listen to me at all. But when the person who made the thing is talking about, here's something that it can do, it's not really very useful for end users. They want to see what other people do with it. And we have lots of old examples of this stuff here, but you've got to get off your backsides and make something. Anyway, so my response here was that it'd be nice to have a bigger crowd, but it's a very crowded space today in terms of basics. Yeah, this is one of the problems now. There are lots of mature free solutions, and you need massive injections of funds to even think about trying to compete. And that's very real. The only way you're going to get to the forefront of search requests and get out there on a big scale is pumping money into it. It's not free. Back in the day, it used to be quite cheap to, put together something, but these days it's anything but free. Because you need to do things like, having you update the web presence, update all the software, everything has to be updated. It's a massive investment of time, and then do the promotion out towards the community. I mean, and when there's so many other options that are much more mature and have been around for a long time and are free, you would need to present them with an equally mature solution that has so many upsides that they choose to change, and that's unlikely. It's hard to imagine that you could do that, because there's probably a dozen, free basics that are open source these days that have, GL bindings, that have, a GL binding with Box2D attached to them. I mean, who cares? This has been done to death. They all produce software that looks great, but they all look the same. In fact, after a while, you can't tell the difference. They might as well just all be the same language. But anyway, I digress. All right, I've skipped a few posts there anyway. So it's getting back to, I guess there's like a misunderstanding here about what the question originally was. Do you mean a roadmap of Kev's future plans to play basic? Yes. 2, Kev communicates with the members of the forum, thus Kevin can now know what features members want to see in future versions. We've done this to death. I cannot understand why anyone hasn't seen this stuff. When we're talking about doing this for 16, 17 years, it's tiring. And I hate to be a realist, but it is kind of tiring. The next line is, on the other hand, if PV can become freeware and may be a good influence on attracting new users, well, if it's freeware, why am I building it? Do you have any idea the kind of... Because we didn't go out there and grab a bunch of off-the-shelf libraries and stick them together and put a price tag on them. Most of the modern products today are that. Now, if we went and put, Box2D under the hood, okay, we go and grab Box2D and write a wrapper for our whatever our display device is, and off we go. It's kind of crazy. I don't mind the freeware option. We have a free version. This was one of those topics that was brought up again early on. the very first demo was 120 days. That was the limitation, 120 days. If you're going to use this thing a lot across that time, the time expired it took 128 days for the timer to time out. For most people, they would never have timed it out. And that was complained about, and people go, oh God, it's got to be free, it's going to be this and that, I just can't do. So we made a free version. And I'll be blunt, I'll say that having a free version and having a retail version is a waste of time. That's one of the reasons why the free version is not updated all the time. It's a massive time drain on you. It's good for end users. I don't have a problem with people playing with PB for free. I don't care. In all seriousness, I couldn't give a shit. But having a free version also means there's no commitment from the person to actually learn it. Right? And it's an important distinction to make. There's no commitment that's required from the user to sit down and try and learn how this thing was thought out to work. Because all these products have different sort of slants. They look at problems in different ways, As for this one here, I guess we're talking about the future plans now. What I think we'll do now is we'll go through one of the old roadmaps to give you some insight as to what the history of this stuff has been. Okay, welcome to part 2. Here is an old design doc. This is by design doc I mean it's a loose list of features we wanted to see implemented at some point. So it's kind of like an idea pad really. And this one here is meant to take us from 1.5 to version 2. Now if you don't know, version 2 is what we classified as effects. So by the time we implemented these new changes, we changed the product enough to warrant that it's a new product. So the first section here, I tend to make this pretty rapidly. This is declarations. In old PB, there you had a force declaration block, and there was an option explicit, but it was an explicit statement, but there wasn't actually the way it was implemented there. It was actually much stricter than what it is. You had to declare everything. It was kind of freaky. So we calmed that down a bit. Which I think is probably one of the best things for BASIC in general, particularly if you're trying to debug something. Often small bugs occur because you've made a typo. It happens to me a lot. I'm a terrible typer, terrible speller, etc. So old versions of PB don't have this at all. That was implemented back in 1.08, which is probably 16 years ago. Talking about some data types here. We're interested in, so we don't have booleans in it. We don't have byte and word internally or double word types. We don't have fixed length strings. We have dynamic strings. Now, there's reasons behind all those things. Most are to do with speed, and we can implement. Look, I guess in this generation here we can, because modern computers now are so quick and the caches are so large. We can have more instructions, and having a bigger cache is important because you need a bigger table of instructions to jump to. If you're unable to cache these things on the CPU when they're being executed, it makes what chokes the whole thing. The performance is terrible. So these are data types that we're looking at for effects. Conversation about more inline support. So I think mod was a function originally in PB, in very early PB. We didn't have shifting in early versions. Arrays, but more jagged arrays. Okay, ability to treat dimensions separately. Yeah. I think array seeding is a good thing that would be nice to implement. Even ranged arrays would be nice, if I'm really being blunt, because sometimes it's kind of more convenient to use the language to do those things than to do if you've got a range, let's say, in a variable, then to shift your range to a legal range for an array. I guess there was a conversation here about what syntax would be nice. Again, this is 15 years ago. Conversation about some pointer stuff, which is actually in PB, typed pointers, which are in PB. I think it's a bit different than that. That's different actually, because here in PB we have a byte pointer. You can't write I don't even think we have a generic pointer at all. It's important to know the size of the data you're writing to memory. So you don't really need pointers to do that. These are added. These are the int function pointers became a thing, but they're implemented different than this. Here we actually have a C-like idea. You get the address of this function in memory, and that's not very friendly in terms of the way PB can operate. The reason for that is you can have functions. PB can have bound functions from external DLLs, and if you just have an address here, there's no way to know. I've got a dereference symbol there. It should be an @ really, like an address of symbol, which makes it's very C-like really. It's pretty much how you do it in C as well. Pretty much it's a bit more messing around, but the principle is much the same. So we actually opted for, you don't have an address of the function in memory, and the reason for that primarily is to protect you from trying to call a bit of machine code or byte code. I guess what it could have done is it could have checked if the thing you're trying to call is within the bytecode block. That would probably work. It's probably safe, I should say. Or if it's an external function, then it would give you the pointer to that bit of machine code. So we actually have a function index thing. There's a command these days called function index, brackets, and you put the name of the function. So in this case here, we would be querying if this function exists in the code, like that, and this kind of statement here. So it returns the index of this in the function table that's internal. That's pretty safe, because now we can call a function, a psub, a bound machine code function, all from the one interface, and you don't have to know anything about that. If the function doesn't exist, this thing returns, I think it might return -1 actually, because functions exist as a stack. I can't recall that now. You have to look that up in the manual. But that stuff did make its way into PB probably relatively recently, probably somewhere around 2010 or something. I don't know. All right, so there's some ideas here that come from C. We're sort of going, well, how are we going to make these things work with pointers? And the answer is not to use pointers. So now, going back to this option here, knowing that this is if I have the pointer of where this function is in memory, and if this is a bytecode function in PB, that's all well and good, but if that's a psub, this call mechanism here is different. So it would fail if I had, the whole point of having pointers to functions is that you can kind of abstract or create like an interface pretty much. Go to the forum and check out, I can't think what it's called now. There's a GUI demo in the forum anyway that does this. If I can find the code, I'll post a link down the bottom in this response. For the time being, we won't worry about it. So I think that as an idea is probably not the best idea. Right, got some pointer stuff that was implemented. A try catch was talked about. Got different types of types or approaches for types, in particular type pointers, which we do actually have. I think it's worked. It's similar to this, but not exactly like that. Again, we're using the dereference to pull a pointer to something. We should actually just use the at symbol for at or address of. If I was going to implement like that, I would definitely put, something like, get pointer or something like that. So it was very readable and less symbolic. If you do a bit of C coding or modern sort of high level languages, they can be very symbolic. There's lots of symbols and operators to learn, and you have to learn the precedence of these things. And it can be a bit of a pain in the ass. Alright, so that was done. We've got linked lists in there, but there's some problems with that still, I think. That's an implementation of how a list could be run in PB, and it tacks into how arrays work. From a low-level perspective, PB treats a typed variable, a typed array, and a list. They're all the same thing. That's why you can interchange them around a little bit. There are limits to that. Yeah, you could definitely hang yourself by trying to pass things through to each other. But yeah, what have we got here? This is missing. This is still missing. Actually, we need some way of telling it where, if we're going to insert something into a list. Should we insert this thing at the start of the list, at the end, or I think at the moment it inserts it at the head of the list all the time, or maybe the end of the list. I've forgotten now. Yeah, I think it's at the head of the list actually. There was a reason for that at the time. I can't think of what it is now. Here we're talking about functions, add support for recursive local arrays, add support for postfixes, which we do support now, allow passing by reference for all data types. We don't do that, and that's the way the runtime works. It's kind of an ugly issue. Some scope control ideas for scope control. Force sub-function to be visible within modular class. Yeah. Again, it's kind of outside it makes no point having scoping controls without some sort of way of wrapping this up within a space. What I mean is that if you have a way of your function here, for example, it's just called private stuff, or how do we know what part of the code is private, what part of the code is public? Because the way PB works is that the source is pre-merged before the compiler sees it. So it just has one big batch of code. As far as it's concerned, it's just one file. So if we had separate files and it understood that they're separate files, you could do that sort of stuff. So it would be that function would only be callable from within that file or any file that was included within it. The original idea was to have modules, and that's still the way I want to go actually. Pretty much just have a way of tagging a block of code that this is like a unique program within the program. It has its own variables, its own functions, its own data structures, etc. And the programmer can tell the compiler that some parts of this are callable from outside the module, some parts are, so they're public or private. Not to be confused with an object. What it would need is that the bytecode to be generated with PC relative. Pretty much everything would need to be PC relative actually. So all variables would have to be local to a particular block in the stack. We can do that. We just need to have a refresh of the instruction set. What I mean by that is that would mean you could compile something as a module, a block of bytecode, rather than pass the source around or rather than use the source code every time to build from. You could just import the module and it would load the bytecode into your program as one block and then continue on. We already kind of do this for how PB works anyway. What you might not realize is that there's a block of bytecode that's embedded in front of your code. That code gets executed before your code starts. It's mostly just some legacy functions that were taken from internal functions and made into bytecode functions from memory. There's probably some other things in there as well. But in the long term, there'll have to be setup code for the graphics libraries. In fact, all the command sets will have to be set up in bytecode. So the runtime and the languages themselves, the command sets themselves are independent of each other. Currently, we have dependencies between the two. Wow. I hope some of that made sense. I know it's kind of waffly. Let's press on. Parameter control. Add support for returning parameter declarations in a function declaration. Oh, okay. So here we can specify in the function declaration here that we are returning an integer. That would be handy for the preprocessor, so it knows the name of the function, the input pattern or the parameter input pattern, as well as the return type. So then if it sees a call to the function before it's defined, it knows what the pattern of the function is going to be. It knows that it returns an integer, so we pop the stack and we get an integer from it and continue on when it's called. Optional parameters has been initialized implemented a long time ago. We don't have overloading though, and that's a knee-jerk, it's a byproduct of how function parameter matching works. In PB, we have this kind of wishy-washy matching where we allow functions or internal functions, mostly the command set functions, to have data types passed into them, and then the function itself takes care of the data type at runtime. It's convenient for the way the runtime used to work, 17 years ago. Today it's a bit of a pain in the backside. But it prevents function overloading from working. So you need to have very strict patterns of what this function is. The name is. Talked about classes. Yeah. That's where we're heading. Here for the classes, this implementing classes in the compiler today would be a nightmare, but not impossible. It would be easier to restructure the way the original compiler worked, which is what I want to do, is actually replace the compiler at some point. But time, etc. I talked about doing a preprocessor that can do this kind of thing for you, and that's one way you could actually go with this. You could not bother adding OO to the compiler. You could have a preprocessor that gives users a very light touch of object orientation. These days there's a whole bunch of products that do this. So here we've got a section about modules, which is what we were calling these kind of code blocks that would become libraries. The idea is that the module has its own, it protects the anything that's declared within inside the module is local to that module and is not visible outside, so you have to publicly declare something to be accessible, such as what the example here is doing. So this type here would not be visible outside of it. And the reason that's useful is you can have a lot of code in your library that's maybe doing small cleanup tasks or functions that are used within other functions that you don't want your users of your libraries calling. You just want to have a very simple interface, or the most simple interface you can, without them being, having the possibility of your declarations and their declarations impacting upon each other. You could have object name with these. And most importantly, include would support binary and source and binary states of modules, as I was talking about before. Alright, the next part of the design document actually talks about, the first part of it talks about features that were to the core language. And this is quite an old document. It's actually, here it's dated the 7th of September 2007. Now it's the 5th of September 2020 today. So we're looking at something that's, pretty close on 13 years old. So these are probably my thoughts posted to a thread in the forum because it's got tags around it. So I've cut and pasted into the bottom of this. If you look through a lot of the old blogs, you'll find a lot of these kind of thought bubbles through them. Thinking about different ideas that need to be implemented or how we can implement those without breaking the bank, pretty much, or breaking existing code, which is always a problem now. In some regards, backward compatibility is a massive chain to wear. Trying to have it be 99% backward compatible is difficult. In most regards, we can't have it be 100% compatible because there are many old examples that rely on practices that are no longer acceptable in PV. Like one of them is addressing objects that don't exist. In very old versions of PV, that was acceptable. So you could run through and you could draw, let's say indexes of sprites. So you could run through a loop and draw sprite 100 to sprite 200 without checking if the sprite existed. In old versions, it would just kind of ignore that logic, but it would fall through all of the logic anyway, if you know what I mean. There was no runtime errors. That's why it was a problem. When that was introduced, that old code ceases to work. And there's been some command names that have changed over the years. There probably should be a few more. In some cases, we've added other command names to try and phase out old ones. That might happen more in the future. There are parts of the naming convention that have been muddled up over the years, but they even were from very early versions. So, the best of intentions and all that. So this conversation here is about PB2D to PBFX, and FX is pretty much using Direct 3D, some flavour of Direct 3D at the time. So we're talking about some ideas for the camera. So we would have a perspective mode in the camera, which is what you've probably seen these old demos that do this, which gives you a scene that's actually now it's three-dimensional. You can render polygons in 3D space, which is what all modern 2D is, basically just 3D with a locked off camera. It's no longer 2D as we know it from years gone by. So here we're talking about rotation modes. We would have, the idea was to have a 2D mode where it works the way it is now, and also have a version that works with depth. So you can have the Z would be treated as, so objects with a larger depth would be smaller in the scene, they'll be further away from the camera, so forth. Or a three-dimensional version which just treats the whole thing as 3D spaces. So sprites became pseudo 3D objects. So in this three-dimensional mode here, we can treat, effectively sprites became 3D objects. In old versions of the effects prototypes, pretty much, or the effects builds, they have 3D objects in them. There's some very crude demos that demonstrate this, there's no media, and it's kind of awkward to get this stuff into memory to render the scene, but you can do it. Some things here for doing polygon clipping in the scene. If we move to 3 dimensions, we need to have clipping of all kinds, really. The idea is to have auto depth queuing. I think that's queuing, yeah. Or have fog, like Doom, for example. So you can use the Z and push. If you rendered something and you set the fog to a certain color, it would be blended with that color the further it is away from the camera. You can do that pretty much in PB anyway. There's a command that does a color blend based on depth, and I think it's RGB something. I forget it is. Like there's a depth version of it to do scaling of colors like that. Yeah. So vector graphics, we needed. Well, at the time it was thought we needed to have things to add a third dimension to existing commands, so you could do a triangle in 3D space, automatic conversion to polygons for all captured items. Well, this is necessary if we're dealing with 3D in particular. We have to convert our primitives into primitives that 3D video cards enjoy, and that's basically triangles. And if we keep them all as polygons, as triangles or polygons, we make things happy. If we try and use the line modes or the dot modes that GPUs have as well, we're constantly changing state, and this creates stalls in your rendering. You can get some cool results, don't get me wrong, but it's probably easier now with shaders, I would say. Most of that stuff's probably moved to being shaders. I haven't done much shader work in probably 10 years, to be honest. So sprites, these are old ideas. Ideas to have chainable hierarchies, that's meant to say. Local would allow sprite to have a vertex list, and graphics object list. Graphics objects can be attached to the vertex. I'm not quite sure what's getting at now. Global can be attached to the parent, where parent's movement rotation affect the child. I think that one's talking about, because there are situations where if you have parental hierarchies where you want the parent and child to be attached to each other, like you would need to have them for a limb system. If you've got a torso and you've got a child object attached as as a neck and a head, another one for some arms and some legs or whatever. They need to be connected with their rotation. Some objects, like in 2D shooters, for example, where you've got a sprite circling another sprite, where the parent is the main ship, for example, and the droid or the probe rotating or following the main ship is a child of that ship. It's hard to know what that's getting at today, to be honest. So there are times when you want sort of both behaviours. I can think of a few other ones too, actually. But so collision response is another thing that you need to have. At the moment, we have sprites against the world buffers. If you don't know that, that's been in PB for 15 years. No one's ever used it. Shows how useful it is. Animation and movement controls. No, I have a bit of an issue with most animation suggestions because they tend to be, classic frame-based animation, which is pretty much useless. And I say that with all the best intentions. It's easy for artists to lay these things out as sequences of frames, but you often find, frame sheets that aren't in sequence, so you can't use them directly anyway. Or you need to alter the sequence to make the animation look correct, because they'll only store the unique frames, not all of the other frames. And if you have things like, think of an explosion animation where you've got a small bunch of projectiles in the middle and they're exploding out from the center, probably disappearing or whatever over time, which back in the day you would use the images for, and these days you would probably use a combination of particles and these kind of pre-rendered animation sprites. It's much easier and much more efficient to store them as their actual size than all the one size frame, for example. So with animation systems, you need to do things like, its orientation, its rotation, its color, all these things need to be cued. So you can have, combine a certain effect with an animation or chain an animation together. I think all the classic systems are probably too simple for people these days. Just saying to someone, you can just run through these series of frames. That works for most classic games. But there's a point where it gets to is you probably need something a bit more elaborate. That's all I'm saying. Basic physics was even talked about, so there you go. What a surprise. Maps, we're talking about rotation. FX map is drawn as a polygon mesh, requires camera. I think these ideas here are additions to what we already have in FX, because FX can do, there's a particle system in FX that's based on sprite and has batch rendering, and a lot of this stuff has batch rendering in it from way back in 2007 or 2006, whenever that was written. I honestly can't remember now, it's that long ago. FX levels type, which renders modes, tiles. One of the problems with our classic draw modes stuff and using Direct 3D at the time was that you didn't have much control over the blend modes. You pretty much had a handful of blend modes, and anything outside of that you couldn't do. You had to resort to software and trying to do a software effect on a buffer that's in video memory is not very pleasant, as you hopefully now know. But maybe you don't. Okay, so this has been an overview of some very old design doc. And this is really just a collection of just bits and pieces. Now, there are other ones. There's a much more organised one than this. I'm not quite sure where it is now. Empty made some PDFs and some animation type things, and it was quite elaborate with this conversation about going towards effects, because there's a lot of things that need to be implemented to make that a reality. moving on. Let's move on to the next thing. Okay, up until now we've been looking at some of the conversation in the forums, some old design doc stuff, that a lot of ideas from there are still active. Well, some ideas are still active on those things anyway. But we haven't got to what the big $1 million question is. What's the roadmap of Play Basic? To me, it's hard for people to understand where you're going without understanding why you set out on this journey to begin with. I hate using the term journey. I really hate that. It's very reality TV. So this is part of a document I started to write, but I realized it was going to take so long to write this thing in a way, to write a script basically, and then perform it would take me the next 2 months to do. I just thought, to hell with it. I'll go through what I think at this particular point. With PB, we have to understand why we built PB in the first place, what PB is intended for, and what it isn't intended for. This is where people get confused about this a lot, So here I'm saying, in order to build a roadmap, we first need to understand where we are and why. The first key point you have to understand is that PB was built for beginners. It was designed for a first language for people to experience programming the same way as what many people experienced programming for the first time in the 80s, and then into the 90s previously on 8-bit systems and 16-bit systems. So where you could have a simple language, where you could write simple code and get something on screen quickly. That's the mission statement of Play Basic. It's not about creating a professional language. It never was. I have no interest in doing that whatsoever. If you want to do that, go learn C. Bye. See you later. It's nuts. So the first thing was to build a product that was for beginners. The second thing was to focus on something that was familiar to people of that era. That's 2D. So we're using Basic and we're using 2D. And that sums up why PB is the way it is. Why PB has been maintained the same way to keep it the way it is. Which people it blows their mind, So if perhaps you didn't find PB until 10 years later or something like that, you would have no idea about this. You think that this is trying to be a professional language. It's not. I'm never intending it to try and do that. If we were, we would go down a different road altogether. We would just strip away everything that's not command set. Strip away all the command sets and just have a very simple but powerful core language, and then build everything else in itself. That's pretty much how all modern languages work, give or take a few bits and pieces. Alright, so this is where we were, and as you recall before, we were talking about this transition from, there was going to be PB, or you can call it PB Classic these days. There's going to be PBFX, and then into a 3D extension for effects. Or a module was going to be, actually. That was so we're starting here for beginners, getting more, less beginner friendly, and then into a 3D version. Still maintaining that sort of familiar basic interface, the simple structures that we have in PB, trying not to get too crazy with things. here I'm outlining the same thing I just said, really. So PB began its life in 2002, 2003. It was born of changes to existing basic landscape, which were focusing on 3D and leaving 2D behind. And that's what happened. Around that time, I think there was two main sort of players that were aiming at gaming, which was like things like Dark Basic, for example, Blitz Basic, of course. I guess Pure Basic is one of those ones there. Well, there are plenty of other ones, like Power Basic's been around forever, and a bunch of other ones actually. So here I'm saying, well, there's a lot of things that I feel were done poorly, and communicated the purpose of PB is one of those things, and that's very true. Over the time, it seems to have been, missed out. People have not gotten the message that this is for beginners. This is meant to be your first language. This is not a destination. This is where you start. You mess around with. Maybe you stay there for a long time. Maybe you don't. I mean, who knows? For most people who like to tinker, that's the kind of product that we were trying to build. Over time, though, people have expectations of you creating a product that can export to 15 different platforms, and has a price point of $10 or $0 or free. Kind of unrealistic, really, in this day and age. And in the current landscape, those things have been done. I mean, to be brutally honest, if you want a 2D product to make games with, well, Game Maker's been around for an awful long time. It's mature, it's stable, has many platforms, supports exporting to many platforms. There you go. It's used in schools all around the world. So the idea that we can sort of compete with that and overcome that in our spare time is kind of nonsense. Just saying. This is where we get to the other parts of the conversation. I mean, what features are necessary to take on the world or to improve what we already have? I think it's a key part of the conversation there is it's easy to list out features. That's easy. Coming up with wacky ideas to add to it are easy. I could probably get 10 of those a day. But do they make a real difference to people at the end of the day? Some would and some wouldn't, like extending the way, having better array support is probably one of those things that could be argued that we need to do, or maybe embedding vector operations, for example, which makes sense if you're going to move into a three-dimensional world, because you're going to need vector operations to do that well. Unless we sort of hide the math away from you, which is what some products do. I think I'd rather it be exposed, but you can sort of avoid it if you don't want to. If you know what I mean. Like, so giving you sort of access to some of the lower level stuff if you need it to do something very specific. Or if you just want to do something quick and easy, use the default libraries to do those things. So features it's hard to draw an idea about what these features should be. If you talk to 10 different people, you get 10 different answers because they have very specific reasons behind why they need something. They desperately need some feature to do something else. Okay, that's cool. But is that request any more or less important than some other person's feature request? I was kind of hoping that with the addition of PB to DLL, this would actually put those controls in the user base's hands. So people who purchase the extension could write pretty high quality libraries, pretty much the same quality as what I can write them at, but they can use PB built-in command sets as their bases and distribute those to other people in the community, whether they want to sell them or for free or whatever they wanted to do. That's fine. I don't care. That kind of model, in particular, we have our compiler. Of course, we have bytecode. I'll write that up. Bytecode, and then we can either do one of two things. We can either convert it to DLL. Thanks for doing that, you silly thing. Or run it or exa. Why is it doing that? Oh my god. Thanks for that. We have this model, so the idea of building a library, it turns out the idea of building a library is kind of foreign to people, which is just building your code in a fashion that is a collection of functions that do this task, whatever you're doing. If you're making a 3D engine, you're going to have, functions that create an object, in other words, a three-dimensional object. And maybe give the user an index to that object, and then you just refer back to that index whenever you want to move it or scale it or rotate it or whatever you want to do, or change textures on it. So the user doesn't have a low-level access to the data structures themselves. They just have this high-level interface. You take care of any potential runtime errors, etc. And because it's running that stuff through PB to DLL, you're getting the bytecode translated to machine code. The performance is pretty much as good as what I can do with C. Now we could do other extensions to that, but they quickly become platform specific. Making DLLs is a Windows thing, but you can do libraries on Unix, for example. But we can't do Unix because we have no version of the runtime that is platform independent. That's what we're trying to do with 165, by the way, is get rid of the dependency of the platform, which sounds easier. It's easier said than done. Particularly, it would be easy if we didn't have any need to support what we already have. If I could go, I'll just get rid of every command set and I'll start again. Problem solved. But then it doesn't do anything. You don't even have a screen, let alone input commands to do anything with. It's not much fun doing some trig operations and having your application stop. So feature-wise, there's a very open conversation there. I don't really know what is the most valid, worthwhile pursuit. I'm pretty sure that if we can get 165 to be stable, and it's pretty stable today. I think the remaining problems in it seem to be because of optimizations, or at least I think that's what the last main bug is caused by. I better check that before I say that, really. If that's the case, then we can wrap up a version of that and say, hey, this is stable enough for people to use. This is our official build now. And then move other products like PB to DLL across to it. And the goal of that, really, is to have, so we have PB to DLL. It can understand the 165 instruction set. Now, I can imagine there's going to be probably a couple of little changes need to be made to these instruction sets over the next couple of revisions to get rid of the command sets, because that's another big, as we were saying before, it's a big monster ball that needs to be addressed, but I just cannot be bothered doing it. It's a massive task. You're talking about thousands of commands that have to come up with some way of making them external from the compiler. That's not going to be slow and tedious. You know, if you download 165 and you hit compile, and all of a sudden it takes a minute to compile something that used to take 2 seconds, no one's going to be happy. It would drive me nuts. And in my 20s, I spent minutes assembling, my game projects I was working on at the time. That was normal. I mean, today I wouldn't tolerate that at all, and no one should. So getting back to this, if we had 165 stable, our instruction set in the runtime, the compiler is stable, we can do our update this thing to work with 165, and now we have that situation where people can write libraries. People can write libraries that are just as good as what I can write them. Ideally, we want to have libraries that are built with this all the way through it. So, if you haven't sort of worked it out, if the main code's built with PB and you understand PB and these libraries are exposed to you, and you need new features, then you could add them yourself in a language you already understand, hit compile with PB to DLL, and then you're updated, right? If you want something very specifically added to your version of the Sprite command set or whatever, probably not the best idea to add it to the Sprite command sets yourself, but you potentially could do that stuff. If the Sprite command sets were given to you in a pre-compiled module, you would just pull it in to your project, add the functions you want, compile the damn thing out. Now your functions look like the same, are effectively the same as the functions I build into PB. There's no difference. Anyway, a couple of things that we have to sort of talk about a lot is, what target platforms. Well, if you're going to talk about targets, which I've done a gazillion times, you can't talk about targeting and exporting without this stable basis. And the reason, if you don't understand why, is that old versions of PB up until this revision here, for the past 17 years, use a dynamically based instruction set. Now that seemed like a brilliant idea at the time, but trust me, it's a massive pain in the backside. There are still situations where I guess you would have to make changes to things in the future, even though I've left some space in the instruction sets to add more core data types and those kind of things to it. What I think might be needed in the future. The old versions weren't static, so I'll give you an example. A command like print, it might have had an opcode of, say, 642 in the first build of PB, and then in the next build it might have had an opcode of 702. The next build it might have been 701. Because the instructions are changing all the time, to make a tool that understands the instruction set that's external from the product is nigh on impossible. It's not impossible to do. I will say that, but it's very difficult to make it work and be efficient and do what you want, because you have to understand every variation of the instruction set every time it's revised. Our model will always be, we'll update this to be in parallel with the current builds of whatever our current build is. In this case, it's 165, but in the future, it will be whatever it happens to be. Without that, we can't do targeting anything. You know, to build a version of PB that runs on Linux, for example, you need to replace everything. You know, just casually replace everything. I would never. I have no interest in building a new version of the IDE. That's for sure. Even though I've got the source code to it now. I didn't write the IDE, by the way. Empty wrote the Playwright IDE. It has some commercial components in it which people mightn't realise that we probably don't have a license to continue using. You don't know. I haven't checked actually. The license would cover the older versions. They're all fine, but whether we can update to a newer version or not, and it's quite expensive, that stuff, by the way. I would much prefer to write the IDE in itself, to have as much of the tool set using PB-based code in it as possible. That means that people who understand PB, can make it do things that it doesn't do out of the box. And that comes with, being able to maybe run modules of PB code through the IDE, which would be possible with this solution here. If we could export blocks of bytecode as a module, for example. Like you might have, certain features tied into the IDE here, for example. What could you do? Oh, well, you can have like a window feature or extra associated tools. You can actually add tools with it, by the way, but most people aren't aware of that stuff. But if you could have hooks into, if you had a command just like a load image, and then had a file name, ship or something. If this was saved to a project and this image was in that location, if we hover over it, we could actually have something that understood what this token represents. That it's a load image command, and knows that this is a file and a literal to boot. It could go, well, do you want to preview the image? Now, if we could build stuff like that into the IDE, that's all fine, but that means it requires a person to maintain the IDE all the time, correct the bugs, add new features, etc. It'd be much, much better, really, if we had plug-in ability for any IDE to add features to it that were written in PB script. So you have the same looking language that you have now to do things in it. If you're familiar with what I wrote with DTAB script, for example, DTAB, I wrote a scripting language for it. And the reason I wrote that for it was actually to take the load off my back and put that on the user base. Okay, this does have script in it. If you look at the code here, it's basically, I'll just cut and paste that out to PB, for example. It looks almost like PB. Just create a new project. So that product, I wrote a language that sits inside PB, that sits inside DTAB, that does a very particular job. So in that case, what happens is when you cut and paste a URL into the drum tab importing page, it looks at the URL and goes, hey, if I recognize this URL, it looks for a script for decoding the HTML and the text out of the body and returns these. So you write a script that has these variables here filled with whatever this thing you're grabbing from it. So in this case, I've made a scripting language that looks like BASIC. It's a bit different than PB. I've got an in string there, but pretty much the process is much the same. We've used the var here for our variable declarations, and in this case it's case sensitive and a little less friendly than BASIC in general, and it does that for a reason, so that if the script fails, you're not scratching your head going, why is this thing failing? It gives you an error about what's going on. Now, my point of showing that is that with your IDE or these kind of or any tools at all, actually, if you could embed PB script into those things, then you could have people who know the language or know BASIC really could make extensions to the language and extend upon what they already do. One of the key ones that I really think is important would be the debugger. So if the debugger was just a PB program that had like a network hook between the two, or just a file sharing map, a file map or whatever, probably network's probably the best way to do it these days, I guess. If it's just a PB program that has a communication, like a client server sort of thing between the app that's running and the debugger, so you could send messages to the application that's running, tell it to stop or whatever you want it to do, or request certain data be sent back to you. Now it's going to be awkward, wouldn't be fantastic, but that could be written in just play BASIC. So if it's written in PB and the code's out there for you to expand upon, and you add your own bits to it, maybe that are very specific to the way your game works or the way your program works, now you can do things that no one else can do. It's not really, it sounds like, it sounds difficult to do, but it actually makes more sense than me writing a debugger myself. Because if I write something that I have to have, a bunch of features tucked away that maybe a few people will use, other people won't like them, etc. So that's where we have to get to. We have to get to a point where we've got PB 165 stable. Our optimizations are embedded in that, which they're not currently. There's a whole list of optimizations that are not embedded in it today, even though it does have a bunch of them that are already in it. They're already been injected into it. We need our tools like PB to DLL to be compliant, to get the best performance possible. In other words, if you want to write the number crunching part of your application and have it running in machine code, you could do that yourself, and this reduces the amount of source code you're building every time you hit run, pretty much. So you build a bunch of these libraries. I think I've posted a few of those examples out there, but I can't recall which ones are which. Some of the tools I've done this for in the past, I went back and took collections of the functions that were doing some brute force stuff, like some image modification stuff, and just ran through PB to DLL, and then just include the DLL in the application. Bob's your uncle, So you get pretty much the same performance you would get writing it in C, give or take. It'll always run a bit slower, I would say. It'll run a lot slower, given that modern C compilers are the product of let's be honest, probably hundreds of millions of dollars of development over 10, 20, 30 years of development. We're not going to compete with that. So don't even think that we can. In some cases, we can get better results because we can use instructions that C compilers don't use. So by thinking laterally, we could probably add things like, you could add support for PB for things like SIMD, or AVX instruction sets directly into them. That would mean users will have to wrap their head around the limitations of those instructions, but if you can do that, you can wrap your your solution into how these things work. SIMD is these are single instruction, multiple data. So you've got this. I'll do it back in PB actually. I'll show you. So if you had things like, if we have 4 variables, for example, if we have, A, B, we want to add, we'll add 10 to A. I'll just do a version that's A and B, for example. We'll add 20 to here. Now, these are 2 separate operations. So even if I dump this out to machine code, we end up with we're reading this, whatever this A variable is into memory, we're adding 10 to it, we're dumping the result back into A. Then we move on to the same operation for here. But these SIMD operators, what they do is that you can have stacks of these things together. So if you could have, in some way, I don't know what the syntax would be. Let's just say we have A, B plus equals 10 and 20. So the idea would be, now if we had SIMD support, now we actually need to have 4 of these, by the way, because you can do pairs, but it's less efficient. These single instruction multiple data opcodes are for packing multiple operations into a single operation. So if we had 4 variables, different variables, and we wanted to add 4 different things to these things here, make a comparison. C and D, we're adding 30 and 40. Now, the first one here, even though they're simple additions, that's still 4 instructions minimum. It's actually more instructions than that, but here this could be done in 1 instruction, and they're all in parallel. So this takes, in terms of clock ticks, this probably executes in 1 clock tick. This is 4. So the theory is you can make certain routines 4 times as fast as what they were before. It takes a lot of wrapping your head around how to store your data, how to process the data in the best way possible. But if you have a lot of data to process, and you need to do brute force operations, like mathematical operations on it, things like vector operations are really good for this kind of stuff as SIMD. MMX is the same thing, but it's limited to doing pretty much, you're limited to 1 64-bit register. So you can treat those things like a full 64-bit register as a 2 32-bit registers, 2 32-bit registers, 4 16-bit registers, or 8 8-bit registers. So you could do for things like text comparisons, you could do or text alterations, or you could do read 8 characters into a register, do an operation on it, and then dump it out. But the data has to be stored in this very particular fashion for it to be effective. That's where it would come down to how well you understand it. Oh wow, what we're getting to here. So we could add these kind of things here, and that would give us a very interesting way of making better use of parallel processing in modern CPUs in particular. Of course, that leads you to threading. We do have some threading support in PB under the Blue Image library has some threading support built into it. And the way it works is it does kind of a queued base. So you can have these big image processing tasks done as a queue on a 2nd or 3rd thread. So you effectively push the job you're doing off your primary, the back of your primary PB thread onto another thread to be done in the background, and when it's done, we use it after that. We really have to really thread applications in PB. You need to do a lot of work. I don't believe that's really that imperative. I think you get better results by having things threaded or made asynchronous in general. So you can think, things like image loading, for example. If I do load image as a little example before, ship dot something, whatever it is. Now, given that where it's in 2020, these things are going to load very quickly, aren't they? But that's not always guaranteed. I mean, the hard drive is like everything else. It's a resource that's being used by your application and Windows as well. At the moment, we have a synchronous processing. So when you call this command here, you're calling a function, effectively load image function, and it breaks it down. It pulls the data off the disk, looks at the header, works out what kind of image this thing is going to be, works out the size it needs to allocate, allocates a surface, copies the damn data across into the surface, and then once it's finished, it packages this back up into a PB image for you to mess around with. A whole bunch of stuff that's happening that you're not even aware of. What we really should have is an ability to load images in the background. So you could go through and do a bunch of image loading, and then once they're ready, you could make an image out of it. So you could. I'm not quite sure what the syntax of that might be, but you might have maybe we had load image group or something like that. Then we have a list of image file names, ship 1 or something like that. Maybe it's an animation or something. Ship 2, ship 3, right. So if we have this kind of concept, at the moment we have no way of assigning what image these things are actually going to be loaded into. Our index I'm talking about. If we could start the group running here, what would happen is it would start up a thread to load these 3 images in the background, but it wouldn't create PB images out of them. It would import the data from the disk, set up a surface in memory, ready for us to then query again. So you could have a load image group here, and then you'd have load image, ship image 1. So you have some other processing going on after the load group, or whatever the command could be called. And then we're doing some other task while these images are being loaded and into memory and being ready, they're waiting for us to actually make an image of them. One way we could do it is using a load image, and then we go we check the group pool to see if the image exists already, and if it wasn't complete, it just waits until that's complete, so we get a stall at this point. But if it's already complete and something else has occurred, then you've loaded your image asynchronously in the background without creating a potential crash. Because load image does a few other things as well. Like if you have images bound to your executable, which you can already do, and use the name, and you've added a resource. If I add resource here, and I say ship1.bmp, the compiler will take this resource, if it can find it, and stick it in a block of memory with that file name header. And when we hit load image, it checks the resources for this image name. If it finds it, it pulls it out of memory and not actually from disk. This would work the same way. Once these are loaded into this pool, we could grab them out of that pool and use them. And we could start the image loading at the front there, so you could have while your images are loading, I guess you probably need a handle as well, group handle or something like that. I'm making this up as I go along, by the way. I've thought about this before. Just never really kind of worked out what would be a neat way of doing it. So you could sort of have, repeat until, what could be image group status perhaps. We check the group handle here if this is true. So we might have a little screen displaying something, print, loading images, and maybe if you could grab the number of images that have been loaded successfully already from it, that'd be neat. So you could do like percentage bars, that kind of thing. But that's one way of adding threading to PB that doesn't require making the whole thing thread safe. And this would be much more useful than, I think, trying to have a function, allow people to write functions that you can thread. If you compiled your PB code via PB to DLL, depending on what it does, that would be thread safe, and those functions can be called as a thread. At least on Windows anyway. I haven't tested that, but I'm pretty sure that would work. Now, it would fail if you're trying to do competing things in your DLL and in your game at the same time. If you're trying to create things on one side and destroy them on the other side, it will crash. Anyway, so threading is something that we probably need to look at wrapping our heads around ways of introducing it or bringing it into the product in a way that doesn't have you rewrite your application to have a thread in it. And the final part we want to talk about really was platforms. There's a lot of conversation about exporting to this and doing that, but again, PB is a beginner-based language. For me, at this point, the only one that I really think is even worthwhile doing is having a HTML5 with JavaScript, or probably WebAssembly, to be honest. So you can export, your export 165 logic across to a web page. If this instruction set is consistent and stable enough, then you could write all kinds of converters to do whatever the hell you wanted it to convert to, convert it to C directly, Once your application's ported to C, you can do anything you want with it. But, it's up to people really. For me, this is something I wanted to do a long time ago, 10 years ago now, probably longer than that. We had a very early product that had PB running through browser extensions. That was a project that Empty was working on, which did actually work. You could run your PB app in your browser, but those days are really, they're over now. People want their applications to run as either native JavaScript or WebAssembly. That won't change as anytime soon, I wouldn't have thought. As for hardware platforms, well, the conversation becomes even more complicated, isn't it? I mean, if you're going to talk about platforms, then you have to start going, well, what API? What graphics API, GL, Direct3D, is it Vulkan? Vulkan, yeah. Metal on Apple platforms, etc. They all have different interfaces these days. It's not feasible to try and build a tool that can spit out everything for everyone. If we continue with the GLL, the OpenGL option, and maybe the Vulkan option, for example, that's probably the best road going forward, because it gives you an option to go, well, we can have this thing running on Linux at very least, and we can translate this to running in a web page within Scripton, for example. We use the same method that other people have been using for the last few years, which I personally hate, but people seem to enjoy it. What I mean by that is they'll take their runtime, their graphics library, the whole thing, run it through in Scripton, and then have their program bytecode and their massive blob of JavaScript running in the browser, and the performance just sucks. To be blatantly blunt, and I mean, compared to things that are written specifically for JavaScript, for example, if I'm going to write anything that produces JavaScript, I'm going to write a converter that does that directly from your bytecode to JavaScript. No runtimes. Stupid. Complete waste of time. But that would mean, in order to do that in any kind of time frame that isn't, in another decade, being a subset of the PB command set. And I've talked about this before, actually. What you would have is you might have to make exporting to a platform possible in the short term. You might have to include, it might be like web wrapper or something like that. And what this would be is it would be a collection of functions that the translator understands on the target. So if you use any other functions outside of the ones provided, you couldn't be assured that your translation is 100%. They might work, they may not. There may well be a structurally different difference as well. So your main loop might have a particular format or something. We might need a function called main or something. Depends on what you're going to try and convert to. So you couldn't just take your old application, hit export to such and such without having to convert it to whatever this target here is. And these wrappers, these targets here, could be maintained by third parties. If you wanted to write one and sell it, etc., fine by me. That also means having to make updates to the forums, having to have the website be an e-commerce portal, basically. There's a lot of things that need to be done to make those things kind of happen, and hopefully by now you're realizing that sounds pretty unrealistic. At least I think it's pretty unrealistic for me. But these are things that I want to do. If you want to hang around and be a part of it, then get off your backside and write something. If we're messing around with adding a feature, maybe let's try and push that feature as far as we possibly can. Because if people aren't doing anything with those things, and if I've outgrown my usefulness of something, then I'll stop writing it. Because there's no need to continue it. So really, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the whole thing in your hands. What you need to do is get off your backside and make a post. I'll make a post on the forum about this after I put the video together. This is going to take forever. You have no idea how long I've spent on this to make this video alone. I've probably been talking here for the last hour. I've probably done 4 or 5 takes of this thing the last couple of days, and a couple of 2 or 3 takes probably a week or so ago. I mean, it adds up, man. Yeah, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the responsibility of of what you really believe are imperative things. Like I can go through things that I think that they're absolutely necessary. What you need to do is formulate your ideas into a concise and provable sort of fashion. For example, what's one I was thinking of before? Oh well, imagine if you have a sprite sheet, for example. If you load in your sprite sheet, load image yet again, my sprite sheet, and that sheet has a bunch of different animation frames on it. Now, if the frames are laid out in a particular pattern, let's say we're loading this to whatever image we want to load it to. Image number 1, who cares? At the moment, what you would do to grab the frames from it is you would cut and paste a little block of that image out of it. You'd just get an image from this image we just loaded in, have a coordinate, maybe it's from 100, 100, 200, 200, and that would get our, that would be this image here. So we push rendering to this image we just loaded. So now our get image is grabbing an image that we're going to call image 2 from this 100 by 100 rectangle or square on this source image. That does an image copy. Now, if we move towards the 3D world, we actually don't want it to work like that. We want it to have a reference back to the sprite sheet. So what you could do is this could make an image here. Maybe you have a flag here or something like that. We'll call it like UV mode or something like that. Mode or something. And you might have different modes. I'll use a string there. Like you might just have normal or default, right? Which would act the way it used to act. Or you'd have a mode for UV mapping. So now, image 2 doesn't have its own pixel data. It uses these coordinates here as a UV map into this larger image of image number 1. So we're saving memory, but when we look at 3D rendering in particular, video hardware likes to have as few images as possible, and we're reusing portions of the image as our sprites and polygon data. You might have heard of this kind of atlasing sort of idea. The way PB works at the moment and the way old versions of effects work, we had to sort of compromise and come up with a different way of doing this, which is what the AFX stuff is all about. I think it even has a concept of, it has a 3D texture mode, which would load the image as a texture on the video hardware, for example, for rendering with the GPU. If you want to have old code that is old PB games, for example, that use sprite sheets, they would need to have UV mapping to make them more efficient. And it would be much easier to port them like that. Anyway, that's just something that comes to mind off the top of my head. So it would be neat because you could treat this as a separate image, even if it's a UV mapped coordinate section of this part here. And that idea could apply to other things in PB as well. But we're getting off the track. So here's my challenge to you. What you need to do is come up with your best maybe 5 ideas and quantify why these things are necessary, who's going to want them, and how they might look, how they're going to function. And then other people can pick apart the different ideas and have a chit chat, and we'll work towards implementing those ideas. Otherwise, it's just me blathering on about things I feel like doing, and you have no interest in those things at all. Which is fun for me, but it's not fun for you. But there are 100 different basics out there for you to use. So, anyway, that's enough from me. I really am getting sick of this. So I'll put it in your hands, and I'll be editing this video for the next bloody week, I can tell. Thanks for listening. It's been a long one. It's been probably the longest video I've ever made in my entire life. And we'll hope to hear from you soon. Thanks again. And